to Dev 364, Advanced User Interface Testing using Coded UI Test with Visual Studio 2010. My name's Anthony Borton. I'm an ALM consultant trainer based out of Brisbane, Australia. So I'm really happy to be over here with the opportunity to talk to you each and all about testing with Visual Studio 2010. Just before I get too far into it, who's had a look at some of the testing features in Visual Studio 2010 already? Just a show of hands. Fantastic. Who's created a manual test? Just a couple. Coded UI tests? No test at all? Excellent. Yeah, you're the developers. That's bad. All right. So what I'm going to talk to you about is I want to go through some of the testing capabilities of Visual Studio 2010. Visual Studio 2010 is it is the best release of Visual Studio ever for testers. So we're going to talk about what are coded UI tests. That'll include a little bit of a wander through manual testing as well. So I'm going to be a little bit flexible, I suppose, in terms of what we're going to have a look at here this morning still. We'll talk about who should use coded UI tests and how we can go about creating them. I'll demonstrate creating coded UI tests from manual tests that perhaps our full-time testers have created. We'll also go through and introduce the coded UI test builder and see what that can do for us. I'll move on to the anatomy of a coded UI test. It's fair to say we really should look at some code in a coded UI test session, so we'll see what that's all about. And then I'll move on to some data binding and how we can data bind those coded UI tests. I'll talk about the supported application technologies. What type of applications can we use to create coded UI tests? Finishing off with tips and best practices. And if we have a couple of minutes left over, we'll certainly do some Q&A. One of the benefits of the session just before lunch, of course, is the ability for us just to wander out there and have a bit of a chat for anyone that has some questions after the session. All right, that's our agenda. So what you see on the screen there is some of the functionality, some of the testing capabilities in Visual Studio. We'll start down the bottom. We've got Team Foundation Server 2010. That's the hub that keeps the team together and provides fantastic reporting of our test progress and a whole lot more. Now, the blue colour there is to indicate that we've had it before, but it's been improved and enhanced in the 2010 release. You'll also see that web testing and load testing are still there. They don't seem to get as much interest as we talk about some of the newer features with a lot more gusto and enthusiasm. But web and load testing certainly still there and incrementally improved over previous releases. We have unit testing there, so hopefully that's something that you're all familiar with, or the devs in the room. Actually, let's have a look. Devs and tests. Developers? Fantastic. Guys, why do you care about testing? Just kidding. Is anyone brave enough to say they're a tester? Fantastic. Great. That's really heartening to see. That means New Zealand has great developers, because you don't need many testers. Is that true? So what's new? If these features have been around before and enhanced, let's have a look at some of the new features. And there's a lot. Do I have any testers up the front of the room over here? Someone brave enough. Oh, look. Be proud. There we go. Fantastic. So have you raised a bug in the last week or two? Fantastic. That's even better. Let me ask a different question. Developers, who's written a bug in the last week? Hey. An undiscovered feature. So one of my goals is to help us discover those just a wee bit quicker. So with the bug that your team raises, or the bugs that your teams regularly raise, is it fair to assume that they include the name of the machine that they were using, whether it was domain joined or not, their logged on user credential while they were working with, the amount of physical memory in the machine, the amount of available memory, the screen res, available disk space. How am I going so far? Probably not all those. Why not? Sack them. Sorry? The availability of the information? So now we're getting somewhere. The availability of the information. Guys, in a Windows operating system, everything I said there should be readily available. I'm not picking on you, sir, by the way. The relevance was the other thing you said. You know, what do we think as testers that developers might find handy or useful in finding the bug? Should testers really be making that decision? Generally not. More than likely, probably one of the big reasons why your testers haven't included that information, time. Generally, testers are certainly very, very busy. Looking at the number of bugs that this audience has raised in the last week, they're very busy. They don't have time to include all of that information. So can we make that a little bit easier for them? So through these extensible things called data collectors, as our testing efforts now take place, data collectors do all that work for us. A data collector, conveniently called system information, goes in there and collects everything I've just spoken about automatically. Your testers haven't got to do any of that anymore. That just gets collected and added to the bug report. Some of the more interesting ones for the developers in the room. What about if we had the IntelliTrace logs automatically attached to the bug reports so we could step back there and actually step through the code, the variable, see what was actually happening at the time from a coding perspective? That's suddenly going to get a whole lot better for us. And as a room full of developers, mostly you'll all agree the bug's not a real bug until it's been raised twice. To combat that, our testers have the ability through a data collector to record video. Fantastic. That helps us believe them the first time. We can go back through there and see exactly what they've done. I figure I can alienate the testers. It's a much smaller portion of the audience. Keep the devs on side. All right. So we can also do things like create an action recording. I know you disagree with me, but testers are human too. They make mistakes. So as they're going through the steps to complete a particular test, it's quite important that we're able to just validate what they've done. So the action recording looks at what they're doing, provides that in a nice textual, easy to read format. And that's really important for us in one of the first demos, because we're going to go through and use that action recording that our testers have created to turn it into a coded UI test. And if you don't like the 8 of these that come out of the box, write your own. If your particular application writes XML files to a directory on the hard disk, write a data collector that goes and grabs those and attaches it automatically to the bug report. As a developer, you get that stuff. Just put your hand up and say, I want the last 10 events out of the system log, the last 20 events out of the application log every time a tester raises a bug. Pretty cool. The next thing we'll have a look at is virtual lab management. So for those of you that came along to my session yesterday afternoon, lab management is absolutely fantastic in the area of testing. It provides the ability to automate the build, deploy, and test process. We can say, here's the application. I want to go over to those Hyper-V hosts. I want to bring up our environment. So the application environment that our testers use may need their own little domain controller because we interact with that. And we don't want to let them touch the corporate DCs. It may need an Exchange box, a clustered pair of SQL machines, some middle tier stuff, and some web servers with network load balancing thrown in. So imagine we can automate the provisioning of those machines quickly, take a quick snapshot, automate the deployment of the application straight out there just by going right-click Q build. We push the app out there. We then automate the coded UI test you're going to see me demonstrate here today. How much time do you think that's going to save a team? As developers, surely you've been called upon to help deploy the application for the testers. That's never a whole lot of fun. You guys seem to have much more fun writing all those bugs. So going and deploying is a time-consuming thing. So lab management, big plus. Particularly with the announcement at VS Live a couple of weeks ago, that lab management is now not a separate product. It is now released as part of the Visual Studio suite. So if you've got Ultimate or if you've got Test Professional, you can use lab management today. Working our way up. Fast forward manual test cases. So our testers in the room will be familiar with the idea of having a number of test steps and working their way through them. Our test case management that I skipped over conveniently. You would have heard me say yesterday, if you were in my session, in 2005 and 2008, we offered a great product that helped with test case management. What was it called? Excel. You were there, good. We didn't really offer much in the Visual Studio stack to help you manage your test cases. That's changed now, so those test cases are managed for us within TFS and reported that way and linked to the builds and everything else that goes on. Our testers, when they go through and work through a manual test, will go through 20, 30, 50 steps, and they'll do it again with different data, their manual tests. And they'll do it again, and on 48, one of those hidden features you put in there pops up. The developer raises it twice. You come back and fix it and say it's done, then the tester goes through 47 steps again just to get to, the action spot. Wouldn't it be nice if we could just highlight 45 of them maybe and just say, you do that for me, and have it run through all the steps on the application under test? And then we'll just take over where it gets a bit more interesting. Does that sound good for testers? I think my tester's snuck in the back of the room. As a manager of a team, does that sound good? If your testers were able to get through those test sequences a lot faster. So that's test case fast forward. And the Microsoft Test Runner is a capability there. The Test Runner pops up on the left-hand side of the screen, gives us lots of room for the application under test. And the Test Runner shows us the steps that we need to do, provides the parameters that we need to provide, gives us an ability to go in there and create the bugs, capture parts of the screen. It's very, very handy. And then finally, coded UI tests. So coded UI tests sort of sit on the different end of the spectrum there. We've put it over here in the land of the specialist, because you've got to be able to code. Although with third-party products, that's probably not even such a requirement anymore. So coded UI tests take all of those interactions, convert them into code for us, and then can execute them. And one of the big things about that is full automation, and then the ability to execute those coded UI tests on the build server. Make them build verification tests, make them happen. You probably won't go with CI builds, because they generally will take a little longer, but let them happen every night. It's an easy thing to do. So that's some of the testing capabilities in 2010. They've done a good job. So what are coded UI tests? So coded UI tests are basically, as the name implies, they leverage the existing testing infrastructure that was provided for us in previous versions and extend upon it. We go into a project. We don't necessarily need to have the source code, of course, for the application under test. We go in, we create a new solution, we add a project, and that project type is a test project. You've probably got them today in 2008. I'm hoping you do, because what sits inside those projects? Sorry? Thank you. One person does unit testing. Nice. You need more testers. So our unit tests sit inside test projects. They're already there. All we're doing now is we're going to go in and say in that test project, right-click, add new, coded UI test, and take it from there. So it's using the existing infrastructure. We go into the test view, all those windows, and the reporting of the test results. You should be familiar with if you're using if that one man is using unit testing in their applications each day. Help me out a little bit here. Now that I've told you, or we've found out that it's unit testing, now who knows what test projects contain? A little bit more unit testing. Excellent. So who uses unit tests? Who in the team? Well, I've looked around to find a typical team of New Zealand developers, and they found that's what they look like. In fact, I recognise one or two of them from the photo. Coded UI tests are generally the domain of developers, hence the coded aspect in the name. That's not necessarily the case. So let me just take a minute to explain a usage pattern. So I don't mean to keep picking on our test person over here, but your group of testers, are they also coders? Fantastic, okay. And performance testers, you've got a great team. In a lot of cases, though, that is not the case. 70% of all testing done today is done as manual tests, someone following a script, not necessarily someone that understands coding. So how I see this tool being used is they'll go into Microsoft Test Manager, which you get as part of Test Professional or Visual Studio 2010 Ultimate. And they'll go through there and they'll create the steps. They'll create the test plans. Those testers are the ones that really understand how to test applications. So they'll do all of those things, and perhaps they'll go through and they'll create the manual tests. And that's really handy in the early part of a delivery cycle. As our UIs are still undergoing quite a bit of change, maintaining manual tests is a lot quicker and easier. Right-click, insert step. There's an extra thing to do now. But then as we move forward, we may have a couple of hundred of these manual tests. As those screens stabilize, we want to move them across to coded UI. And as coded UI tests, we want to be able to then go and automate those and have them happen every day. Look for regressions on a daily basis. So our manual testers still have a role to play there. Now, there are also third-party tools which are fantastic that allow testers to create the test in Excel and then go and generate the coded UI code without knowing anything about it. So coded UI is quite a rich thing for coding testers and non-coding testers alike. So quite a bit of interest there. If your team of testers is not familiar with development, with code, should I say, then perhaps maybe one of the developers on the team should become a test liaison. It's not a punishment. It just means that you get to work with those testers to put the polish, maybe to do the data driving of some of those coded UI tests. So how? How do we go about creating these things? I'm getting bored with slides already. I think we need to see the product. Thanks for that enthusiasm. All right. Last slide before the demo. So we create coded UI by basically recording our interactions of the application under test. We can do that through the coded UI test builder or from existing action recordings. We can generate that in your language of choice. And then we go in there and we can add assertions, a very similar concept for those of you using unit testing today. So now, let's see how it's done. Now, hidden under here somewhere. One. I just want to do that. And two. Fantastic. So what we're looking at there is Microsoft Test Manager. So this is the tool for manual testers. And I want to go in there, and I've got a test suite, and I've just called that end-to-end. I've got a single test case that I've already written, and if we open it up to have a look, you'll see there are a number of steps down here. Open Internet Explorer, navigate to this address, and so forth. If you've used TFS before, you'll recognize the top part of this screen. It's a work item. So I'm going to jump back out of there now. That was a parameterized test. I should have pointed that out because I don't think anyone had indicated they've done a manual test using this tool. So when I've gone through my steps, I've said enter the first name. And all I've done is place that little @ symbol at the start to tell me that's a parameter. If you look down across the bottom here is a table. And when I typed @first name appears as a column heading. And then I can just go and put lots and lots of different parameters in there depending on how many different value sets I need to run through this particular test case. If you've already got some existing test cases in Excel, highlight the cells, copy, paste straight in here. Not a difficult thing to do. I move across from the planning stage into the testing stage. I'm just going to want to make sure my screen's a bit clear behind the scenes. I'm going to go and select the test case that I want to run. Now again, this is manual testing. I'm using it to show the evolution from manual to coded UI as one of the two ways of creating coded UI tests. So if I go in there and say that I want to go and run it, I'll choose run with options just for this example. If I was using Lab Manager, I can go and assign this to a particular build. I can choose the environment that I want to test in. So I may have a wonderful environment over there pre-created with all the VMs that I need. I can go and choose my test settings. How much information do I want to get? How many of those data collectors should be active while I'm doing this testing? And I'm just going to choose the default set. So let me say run. And what you'll see is the Microsoft Test Runner will appear on the left-hand side of the screen. Furthermore, it redraws the background to ensure that the test runner can't be covering any of the application under test. You'll see that by little icons that have jumped across. And it's saying, would you like to start our testing? And I choose to say yes, and I'm going to create an action recording. Now, a test case can have one action recording associated with it. When I'm creating an action recording, it's basically the steps that I want recorded to allow me to go and rerun this in an automated fashion, fast forward through it later. So typically, when I choose that, I'm a little bit more pedantic, a little bit more pronounced in my steps as I go through the application under test. That's just me. So let's give it a try. Start the test. Step 1 says that I need to open Internet Explorer. Okay, I think I can do that. And while I don't need to, because I'm doing an action recording, I'm going to mark that as a pass. Try that again. Too many clicks. The next thing it tells me to do is to navigate to a particular URL. Happy with that? Click Model Airplanes. Click View Plane. Click Add to Cart. Click Checkout. Now it gets a little bit more interesting for us. So what it's done is it's gone and grabbed the first value from my parameters, and it's told me that I need to go and enter first name, and from the list, the parameter array below, this is the first value. And on the realization that testers can make mistakes as well, rather than requiring them to type it, we've automatically put it on the clipboard buffer. I simply need to go and tell it whereabouts in the application under test I need to actually bind this value to. So I'm going to choose to click over here, and then I'm just going to go Control-V to paste it. And I'm going to move off the control, and what you see over here is a little symbol indicating that it's now wired up. The test runner knows that that parameter belongs over here somewhere, and I've shown it where. I'll give that a pass. I put myself in the penthouse suite. Did you like that? Nice little waterfront apartment. Beautiful. I'm going to put myself in Seattle. I like to be near Bill. From the list, I'll choose USA. Move over to state. So I finished binding each of those parameters, and it tells me next to click Review Order, so I do that. That's a pass. It tells me to click Place Order, but notice on the left-hand side now, it's telling me there's an expected result. And as a manual test, that's an indicator to the test that is stop, look for whatever's expected, and confirm its presence. It's actually a validation step. And in this test, I've only got one there in this test, but it's the only one that actually requires me to indicate a pass or fail. If I fail to do that, the test itself's a failure. So I'll go in there and say the grand total should be $50, so click Place Order, and sure enough, the grand total's $50. So I'll mark that out as a pass. It tells me to close the browser. Like a good unit test, these things should be stateless. So I go in there and I open a browser. If I open it, I should close it. So let's close it. And then I'll end that iteration, and if I had multiple sets of data for this particular test, it would move me to iteration 2, and away I go. Wasn't that fun? So I'll go in there and save and close that test. And I now have an action recording attached to that particular test case. And I know that you enjoyed it so much that you'd like to see me do it again. Except for this time, it already knows much of what needs to be done. So how about perhaps in the meantime, our developers have gone and given me a slightly updated version. So I'm going to select the first option, whiz my way down to Review Order, and I'll just say, how about you go and do it for me? And in a moment of complacency, I'll look away from the screen and challenge the demo gods to smite me. They regularly do. So it's walked through the steps that I've asked it to do. That's the idea of test case fast forward. It's taken me to where I asked it to review order. Great. So it tells me to click place order. I'll do that. $50 is correct. It's a pass. Close the browser. Pass. And we're done. So the action recording contains everything we need to basically fast forward back through that application. What do you think? Is that all right? Okay, a few nods, good. So let me jump out of here now. Save and close that. Jump out of here. And something a little bit more familiar to most people in the room. Jumped across into Visual Studio, going across to Team Explorer, waking all the little projects up. And there's one there called Tailspin Toys. Now, while that does contain the code for the application under test, we aren't going to be using it. Okay? It's always SQL. Come on, there we go. I go into source control. Let's go and run the solution and open it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and create a new project. I'm going to make it a test project, and we're going to call it Functional Tests. Now, just like any test project, it's going to open up its default unit test there for us, which I'm not going to use. So let's just jump back out of our unit test. And what is more interesting for us now is to pop up here, right-click, and say I want to go and add a coded UI test. Now, I've got a choice here. Do I want to create this coded UI test by having it record my actions through the coded UI builder? Or do I want to go and use an existing action recording? So testers will have created those action recordings already. But for the developers in the room, so long as you've got Visual Studio Premium Edition and above, you can create these coded UI tests typically by just using by using the coded UI test builder. And I'll show you that in a moment. For now, I'm going to choose the second option and use the action recording you just saw me create. Now, what it's asking me here is, where's the test case that we're interested in? And I find that I've got a single test case there. It has an action recording attached to it. Interestingly, I know that by the absence of a little symbol here. Maybe I think that probably should have been the other way around, but nonetheless. So I'll select the particular test case and say OK. And what it's going to do is it's going to look at the action recording and it's going to write the code for me. So it's written that code. You can see the various steps as we walk through it. If this was a unit test, how would I run it? I'd basically pop up to the toolbar and I'd click a button. And then that'd go and run the unit test for me. Well, that's exactly how we work with coded UI. Suspense is building. Woohoo! A pass. I'll take any win I can get. What have we just proven? We've passed a test. No one finds fault with that at all? Yep. I didn't. But that's okay. I'm just going to tell my manager it's a pass. There is no verification. A manual test rightly required me to stop and look at the screen. We haven't done that here. So all that's really telling us is that we didn't really get a 401 or any other type of error, a 404, as we ran through those steps. That's not too helpful for us. So what I might do is work my way down the list, have a look where we click place order. And I might choose to jump in here where I close the browser. I'm just going to comment that out. And I might run this again. Whoops, we did something silly. Now, the reason I'm coming out the step that closes the browser is because the $50 was on the screen that was currently being displayed to us. So I just want this to run through and take me back to that screen. Nearly there. So it's a pass, but more importantly, I've got the application open with the $50 that we're really interested in. And what I'm going to do is go back over here, jump into there, and I might go and make a little change. I might say, right-click, generate code using the Code UI Test Builder. Now the Code UI Test Builder pops up down the bottom here, and I'm going to grab my control picker and navigate across the application under test. And it wanders the DOM, and I find the particular object I'm interested in. It then interrogates that object and finds all of the properties available for it. And keeping it simple, all I really care about is the inner text property, and it should equal $50.00. So if you notice over here, they're broken down into search, control specific and generic. So how it goes about finding the control, individual properties of the control. The one I want there is inner text. I'm going to go and add an assertion. Just while I've got that screen open, I can also use this little navigation panel. So if I can't quite get to the control that I want, I can basically walk up and down the control hierarchy by moving those arrows. Perhaps it's hidden, or perhaps I can't easily click on it. I'm going to add an assertion, and it says, well, what are you looking for? And I'm going to say, well, it's got to be equal to this exact value. But I've got a lot of choices there, and I'll say, OK. Go and write that code for me, and I'll give it a name. Check cart. Let's type it properly, that always helps. Check cart total. Go and write that. And I'm done now. That's just going to close that out for me. I'll go back here and close that. Jump over here. Uncomment that. Now I have a method there to check cart total. If we go in there and have a look at the definition, you can see where it does the check for $50. And I'm just going to do that. Don't watch as I do that. Yeah, it's too late. This is not where you edit these values. So do as I say, not as I do sometimes. So I'm just going to save that. That's basically what you just saw there. It's designer-generated code. You shouldn't edit that. But in the interest of proving to you that a real test is actually going on there, that a real check is working, I thought it was important that you see that. So I'll pop back up here now and say, give that a run. And what we should hopefully see is going to be a failure of that test. Fingers crossed. And as expected, a failure. Never been that happy to see a failure, really. So we go in there and double click. And what it's telling me is that we expected to find $51. What we received was $50. Now, more than what I've just shown you, and that was fairly straightforward, of course. I could have had 20 assertions on that screen. I could have placed an assertion on every screen if I wanted to do that. I could have been checking for the presence of the Tailspin Toys logo in the top left-hand corner. I could have been checking for the dimensions of a particular control on the screen. You name it. And it doesn't even have to be a web application. I could have been using a WPF application. I could have popped open the calculator and had some fun with that. I'll give you some more information on that a little bit later on. So we've just created a coded UI test. So let me close out of this. Pop out of there. And I mentioned to you that I would show you an alternative method for doing this. So I can go into my functional tests, right-click. Actually, I'm going to make sure my browser goes away. That was the one left open from before. I'm going to go in here and say I want to create a new coded UI test. This time I'm just going to record my actions. I'll say OK. Now the coded UI test builder popped up down the bottom corner there now. Now, unlike the previous demonstration where I leveraged an investment that my manual testers have already done, now I'm just Mr. Joe Developer, and I'm going in here and it's going to record my actions. So I'm going to go to the Start menu. I'll choose All Programs, Accessories. And I'll click back in the middle of the screen. And remember to click Record first. Makes a huge difference. We're going to click Record. I was seeing who was paying attention in the audience. I'll go back over here, and as I click Start, notice a little bit of toast pops up here and says, click Start button. Cool. I'll go and say, All Programs, Accessories. Let's fire up the calculator. Let's do a little bit of maths. 9 times 6 equals. Fantastic. I'll go over here and let's write the code for that. Simple multiply. I'll even leave the typo there. I'll pick up my sniper scope, control picker. Get in trouble for that. And I've chosen the the text box there. If we have a look, I can expand that out and I can see the UI map. I can interact with the UI map. These are basically all of the controls that are there, how it goes about finding them, what ones are being interacted with by the test. And I can work with those. I can manually add them. I can go and choose other controls. It's not a difficult thing to do. I'm going to choose display text as 54. That sounds good to me. Let's add that assertion. That looks good. Write the code. Check total. It's also important that we remember to clean up after ourselves. So I'm just going to record an additional step there, and the step's going to be a very straightforward thing. I'm just going to close down the calculator. Because one of the benefits that I told you about Coded UI Test is the fact we can be running these on the build server. So we don't want all of these versions of Calculator or any application hanging around on the server. So I'm going to record simply closing that application now. Just remembering if you forgot anything. No. Close. Calca. Typing's always good. Now, Calculator was very, very straightforward, but I chose Calculator just as an example of what type of application. Just good old Win32. So I've done Win32, we've done web. I don't think I've got a WPF on here. Sorry, I just missed that. Can you run it against? A map control. A map control. We'd need to look specifically at the control in question. So there are some issues. I've got a slide coming up later where I do talk about some of the issues. It's not absolutely flawless. There are some concerns there. So let me come back to that. Please make sure I do. And then I'll go and close that and let it have a quick think about it. And just while I wait for that, I guess in starting to address that question, it depends on the control vendor. It depends how the control's been constructed. So if you have a look at some of the big vendors today, some of their previous control suites had issues in a web browser because they weren't passing all of the properties through. And really, probably you can't forgive them. You can forgive them for that. I mean, if you've created constituent controls, you've created a custom control, you've put a lot of child controls in there, do you pass every property up? No. Only the ones you're interested in. And as a result of that, some of the, that leads to a few of the issues. So Microsoft is taking a two-pronged approach to that. They're working with the vendors to make sure the next releases of all of those controls work with this system. They're also investigating other alternatives to potentially go back and retrofit workarounds in place for it. So it just depends on the particular control. Try it. All right, so it's going to run that test for me. And look, that was a very straightforward test. I could go and add extra things in there without too many problems. I guess you need to see it run. There's just no trust in the world today, really. So a Win32 application under test. And again, there can be issues with Win32. Did that just happen behind the scenes? Or did it happen so quickly I wasn't paying attention? Option B. Excellent. All right. So let's switch back over here. All right. So you've just seen creating a coded UI test. So the anatomy of the coded UI test. So I want to go through and simply walk you through that. I probably could have done that without the slide. And one more. So when a coded UI test is created, what it does for us is it creates that class. It also creates the coded UI test. And if we go and have a look at everything, you'll see underneath here, we have the designer and a partial class. And if I go in and have a look inside the designer, what you'll see is that it's broken down into a couple of different areas. We can see that we're opening Internet Explorer. There's a few things, like the default page there is blank. When you are looking at doing test automation, it's very important, and you'll certainly come unstuck a couple of times with issues to do with default pages. Pop-ups are a disaster for working with tests. So it's not uncommon to need to come in here and work with those test cases through code. So make little modifications and changes as you go. I managed at TechEd Australia last week to do something really interesting. I closed the application twice, which I didn't really know you could do. And sure enough, it recorded 2 close actions on the exact same window. Now, I'm putting that down to some issues with the virtualization and so forth, but it was an easy fix. It was go in there, look for the code, just strip out the lines that were causing me some grief. All right. Now, a couple of things. Anything that you see in these designer-generated files, you shouldn't edit. Now, as I said to you before, and as I demonstrated, we really don't want to go in here, find where we're substituting values in and start editing them. Any changes we make here, if we then use the designer to make any changes or updates, will be overridden. Now, they've made that very easy for us. So what I want to move on to is the idea of data driving these tests. So who's ever looked at data driving a unit test? Well, the good news is it's very, very similar. It's a very easy thing to do. So as I've gone through there, I'll go back to Tailspin Toys. I wanted to go through there and perhaps let's go and put 2 or 3 customers through there, and that data, of course, can come from an XML file, a CSV. It can come straight out of a database, much like unit testing. And in fact, we wire it up the same way, nice and easy. Now, it does require a little bit of coding for us to do that. So what I'll do is close a couple of these windows. I'm going to go into my test view, give that a quick refresh. Hoping that window really starts to look a little bit nicer. Cool. Has anyone seen a test view window look quite like that? Seems to be a new bug with feature, sorry. Yes. Quite often when you compile external components as well, I get the same thing that you'll see here. You can just close it and when you come back it will be fine. Close the whole lot here or just the window? No, just that one window. All right, let's try it. All right, so I'm just going to try a couple of quick things there. Check those changes in. Just going to reboot the IDE. Actually, I'm going to open it back through this way. That might just slow down the data binding a wee bit. Always works. All right. Sorry? Too much, too little, dodgy memory? It was just memory. Okay. That works. So what I've got there now is my coded UI tests. Oh, and guess who's been creating a few of these things? I think that was the right one. So I'm going to go in and let's have a look. This one here it'll be. So I go into my data connection string for that particular coded UI test. I'll go in there and choose the data source, and in my case it's just an XML file. I'll choose the XML file. Okay, so I've just put 2 rows there. You don't need to see too many repetitions. That's the one I want. Yep, that's fine. So what I've done there is I've grabbed the XML file, I've data bound or set a connection string property so that the test knows where to find the data. The next thing I need to do is actually go and edit the test. So I'll go back over here, open up my coded UI test. You'll see there, that's where it's added the lines of code, or the line of code for the connection string. What I'll do is go down and, okay, wrong test. Nice. Okay. So guess who completely missed the flow of his demonstration? Nice. So I'm going to go into tailspin back. So tailspin back, as the name implies, is the wonderful little backup. And if I have a look in there, that's the line of code that I wanted to show you. So that's the connection string. And if I just work my way down, when I recorded this particular test, and I won't walk you through it just now. When I went through and recorded the calculator, if I can just walk you through the stages, I went in there and said I want to hit record, and I went through and I clicked things and I said equals, and the result came up and I generated the code. What is a better way of doing that, or what makes it a lot easier for you if you have a look at those top few things there? It's better that as I work my way through Tailspin Toys, I might open the browser and I'll choose to generate my code there, and I'll give it a method name that's easy for me to understand what's going on. I'll just call it Open Browser. And I'll then continue, and I might go and add Fourth Coffee Flyer to the shopping cart, and I might generate that code with a meaningful method name. So going through, it takes a little bit of extra time for you to record those tests, but the benefit of that is instead of having just these single methods that do everything under the sun, it's broken down far more conveniently, as you see up the top there. So enter customer details to place order to do this, so on, and close the browser. It just makes that a lot easier for us to maintain and manage that code. And in terms of data binding it, what I want to do is just here, where I enter the customer details. This code here, I just conveniently popped over there, opened up that little snippet so you didn't have to watch me code. It's already there because it's my backup. So what I would do is I go in and use the UI map, and then you'll see that I've got for this particular test, that class has already been created. And if I have a look, you can see where each of those values are, where we go and actually put the first name, the last name, and so forth in, and then any key interactions that we have with the control. So in this particular case, if we just look at the line below it, let's make it so we can see a bit more of it. The data binding here simply says, before we go and make this call, I want to go into the UI first name edit text, and I want to go and grab this field, or the value of that field, from the data binding source. And then I've simply copy and pasted that for each of the different things that I want to data bind. And trying to remember when I last did this. So let's see if this test works. So he's not feeling altogether optimistic. When he goes back to his backup, he's thinking, what has he done to this VM since that backup was made? He's hoping. So we go through the first iteration of our data-bound coded UI test. Okay, excellent. It's remembered that I belong in the penthouse up the top. Nice. I like to be close to Steve Ballmer, but he doesn't get a penthouse. And we're done. So when I chose to go through and show you the calculator, that was a break from my usual flow there. I just wanted to show a different type of application, just Win32. What I really needed to do there to lead into the data binding demo would have been to walk back throh Tailspin Toys and just to create those or generate the code at each of those different steps so I could data bind it. That's the only reason I dropped back to the backup plan. All right? And guess it, click one more. In the wrong direction. Excellent. All right, so that's our data driving tests. So now on later. The purpose of this slide is really to allow us to talk about the types of applications that we can use this testing infrastructure for. So you've seen me do that with a Win32 application. That was the calculator. We've gone in there and we've used IE and driven a standard web application. I think it was MVC, if that makes any difference to you. Microsoft have released support for Firefox now, so you can use Firefox for these things. We can work with standard .NET applications, but third-party controls can be problematic. Now, basically what it comes down to is when we go and record our test and attempt to play it back, perhaps it can't find those controls. In a lot of cases, all we need to do is to go in there and just have a look at the code for the searcher and simply update it. If we wanted to work with Excel, then all we need to do is just say, look, no, I'll take care of finding the cell, and you just go and write a bit of code you may have already done with a Visto application. So it's not altogether impossible. It also works with WPF applications, but something that we wish was there that's not there is Silverlight. So they've currently got a limited CTP for the Silverlight testing support. So at the moment, if you're working with Silverlight applications and you'd like to use this testing framework, you plumb out of luck. But the good news is it's due by year's end. Hopefully we'll see a public beta of that available shortly. All right. So I guess the main story there is there's some really great support for it. There are things like Microsoft are not supporting IE6. It just needs to die. So no IE6 support for the testing harness. It's not to say that a third-party vendor won't go out there and use the extensibility points and write that. It's just that Microsoft don't supply it. Likewise with a couple of other things. All right, so that's our application types. Some tips for creating coded UI tests. Firstly, wrap our launch event in our using clause. So basically, if you can imagine that when we go and fire up the browser, if we have a number of assertions in there and it fails at any point, when we go and automate this back on the build server, we don't want to have these failed applications hanging around. So basically, in the launch event of the application, make sure you've wrapped that in a using clause so that when, unfortunately, the application fails, it will fall out of scope and will be cleaned up automatically. So I guess let me just reiterate a point there. One of the big strengths of coded UI tests is the ability to run these things on the build server. Okay. The next tip there, use some of the assert overrides to provide extra information about where the failure occurred. So as I said to you, you can place multiple assertions in a single test. And much in the same way that you can use overridden assert methods today with unit tests, you should do the same with coded UI. Just to give you a heads up, this test failed, which of the 5 assertions did it actually fail on? Some little text inside there can make life a little bit easier for you. Keep an eye out for additional application support. As I said, Silverlight support's due by year's end, but the beta should be out for that fairly soon. If you want to do testing with Firefox, that's available as a third-party add-on. If you are currently using TFS today, a GDR was released about 2 weeks ago. Does anyone know what that GDR contained? That was basically the shipping update for lab management, but it also included a number of bug fixes and so forth. So if you're currently using TFS today with Visual Studio, if you've got the Test Manager product on there, Test Professional, make sure you grab that GDR and apply it. Okay? And then down the bottom, look at the test API available on the Microsoft website. So on the Microsoft website, you can find the SDK, or find the API there, you can actually code drive pretty much everything you've seen there and extend on it quite greatly. I think that particular, inside that test documentation, you'll also see how to create add-ons for Microsoft Excel to allow you to go and automate some testing through some Office products, in this case, Excel. All right. Some related content. So basically, tomorrow there, a whirlwind tour of the Microsoft .NET Framework 4. I've called out Visual Studio 2010 tips and tricks as something that may be useful for you. On Wednesday afternoon, implementing CFS 2010, a real-world perspective, is about a local adopter of TFS and what that experience was like for them, how they went with migration of their source code from Visual SourceSafe. And, what was it like? What are the goods and the bads? So well worth having a look at. The New Zealand ALM conference is scheduled for April. Actually, I think that's going to be the very end of March next year. That's going to be based in Wellington. So basically a small tech ed focused on application lifecycle management, including development, of course, and testing and operations and so on. All right. And with that, I'd like to thank you very much for coming along to the session. I know there's a few people in the audience eager to get out there for some lunch. I'll be hanging around, so thank you.